Hi, it's Martin and Jack for this week's weekly. How you doing, Jack? Are you good?
I'm all right. How are you? Whereabouts in the world are you?
Whereabouts in the world are you? I'm in Venezuela. No, I'm not. I'm in
Oh, wow.
Chesterley Street.
About to say that Robson Laidler branded. I didn't know we'd opened a Venezuelan office.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I take me Brandon everywhere, Jack. No matter where I am, I stick the banners up. Look like makes you feel like you're at home.
Oh, all right,
Um.
yeah.
Anyway, right. I've got three little tax things. Which one is interesting, two are routine. I'll start with the routine first. So first of all, HMRC are looking to change the amount of income you need to then submit the tax return. Now, this is for people with taxed income, so it's probably people with salaries and pensions, that in receipt of pensions. And at the minute, if you've got income of over 100 grand, then they don't expect you to submit a tax return. And I think the logic is probably if you've got a decent amount of money coming in, you've probably got other stuff going on. And of course, the tax will be higher because you'll be paying a higher rate of tax on that. But they're actually changing it from 23-24 tax year. They're only going to ask for people with income over 150 grand to submit tax returns. I'm not sure what the logic is here because once you're over 100 grand, you lose your personal allowance. Once you're over, 125, you've lost your personal allowance and you're back down to normal 40%. And then once you go over 150, you pay 45% tax. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happens in that band. And I can only imagine they've looked at the data of the people submitting tax returns, and people that earn between 100 and 150 aren't that interesting, or there's not that much going on that they care about, is the best way I can describe it. Um, so this is good news for some taxpayers. If you're on between 100 and 150, you might find that you get a letter saying you don't need to do a tax return. So that's
It's
good, I
always
suppose.
it's always nice to hear that sort of news, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
with my auditing head on, I imagine they probably crunched the numbers and looked and went, actually, in terms of the tax that we could potentially miss out on due to incorrect
yeah.
tax calculations, it's not worth our while. We need to focus our energy
Exactly,
elsewhere. So you're
exactly.
right.
Yeah, they're just not that interesting mathematically, economically, from a productivity, whatever you want to do. HMRC have got more stuff to do than ever. If this simplifies, if this knocks a couple of 100,000 people or whatever it is out of the system, then good. A cynical view would be that people will then forget to do tax returns, and HMRC will eventually catch them and say, "Why did he not do the return?" And
Hmm.
this is for people who have other things going on. A good example of this would be someone who might start, receiving rental income. They might move house, keep the house, become a landlord for the first time, and forget. Sorry, that's what
Hmm.
they say. Forget to notify
Yeah.
HMRC that they're receiving your new income. They ordinarily wouldn't have forgot if they'd been asked to do a return. It would be an obvious prompt. Have you received rental income? I think
Hmm.
the fact that this range of people are going to drop out of the system only to then possibly be discovered later with interest and fines and penalties is a genuine chance. I don't think the revenue have done that for that reason though. I think it's just that they've worked the numbers, like you say, and it's just not worth it. Um,
Hmm.
Another interesting point on the tax is there's been a case decided recently. I don't know how you say this. I'm going to say Nduka, Nduka. Submissions are welcome for anyone who can correct me on how to say that. But this is an NHS doctor who basically claimed a whole load of different expenses. Now, if you're employed, there are certain types of things you can claim, certain types of things you can't. Most of this case is basically summarised by the fact that the taxpayer was deemed to have provided unreliable evidence. I haven't read the full detail, but the summary seems to suggest that this person had basically changed their mind a number of times along the way to the tribunal to try and make up something that seems plausible. Um, but there's a couple of interesting quirks in here, and not none of which are news to followers of tax, but always just worth setting as a reminder. He had many and varied claims of different figures, different excuses, and arguments. but ultimately he largely failed in the main. The one area that he did manage to succeed was that he was paying professional subscriptions to a body that was on HMRC's list of approved bodies. Now, the first thing here is you might think, well, I'm paying a professional fee, therefore it's an allowable deduction. It's worth reminding people that there is a list of allowable deductions. In our game, Jack, there are any number of various ways you can keep up. But you've got to be sure that you keep it up in a way that HMRC argue is something that you need to do for your job. So we have professional fees that have to be paid to remain members of our professional bodies. That's a no-brainer. They're on the list. What's interesting though is if we were, I don't know, woodworkers, and we were members of a voluntary body of, Woodworkers United of some kind, you might say, well, we're glad that you're trying to take it seriously, but that probably isn't on the list of things that they deem to be necessary. So just because you're paying a membership fee or a professional fee, it doesn't mean that it's a tax allowable one. There is literally a list. It's worth a look if you're not sure. And that was his only success. Of his many failings were the fact that he was trying to claim driving to work, his normal commute is never allowed. It doesn't matter if you're commuting far or near, your commute is not allowed. And another interesting one that perhaps is more relevant, that is a less obvious one, is the fact that he'd claimed for a deduction for a laptop or computer equipment of some kind to help make notes to do his job. But he was actually provided with a laptop by his employer, the NHS. So HMRC have basically said, this was a choice. You have a laptop you can use. You didn't need another laptop. In the wording they've said is, they actually also doubted whether he'd even bought a laptop because he was such an unreliable evidence giver.
Yeah.
But they've said even if you have, the purchase was a matter of choice and not a requirement of your job. So this is an interesting one because we've got clients who will probably try and just claim a laptop every second year or every year. There is a point at which you're choosing to do these things. Now, I've not seen the HMRC make this case. Normally, if you've got something you clearly use for that thing, that's all right. What was interesting here is they said, well, and it's almost implied, if it was just to make notes, you can make notes on a piece of paper. You didn't need a computer. And if you did need a computer, you already had one. So, I know you're a fan of the notebook. In this case, they would say, well, you can't claim them as a deduction. You've probably never tried, I suspect.
Well, it's generally because I get about 3,000 of them in every conference you go to. So
they're
never short of.
Yeah. But if you're buying them, it's quite interesting because you use them in every meeting, everything you do. You make a paper record before you then go in, type up your notes or whatever. In this, HMRC would say, well, you didn't need that. It was a personal choice, not a business expense, which is quite interesting.
Yeah,
there
was a couple of interesting. Yeah, definitely. I suppose it can all really come back to wholly and exclusively for the business, if in doubt, because even
as an employee, you've also got to prove that it was exclusively as well. This wholly necessarily, I think, is the business deduction, but exclusively is an extra step for employees. But largely, if you're doing something purely for business, it has to be needed as well, and not just a choice.
Yeah.
So I think that's the takeaway from that. But also keep your records. Like I say, this guy, he failed largely because he was an unreliable witness.
Yeah,
providing unreliable evidence.
It's similar if he was on trial for something more sinister like murder. He kept changing his story. It does undermine you in terms of your credibility, and it's the same.
It just be credible, and you're probably off to a good start. What was your thing then, Jack? You said you had a curiosity or an interesting thing worth.
It was an interesting scenario. So we had somebody come in for a meeting last week, who had been given some advice by their previous accountant around the status of their business in terms of trading. So they were advised to keep their business dormant, but in the meantime, he was developing a prototype for a product, and he's been working away on that for the past 7 years whilst having this business dormant in the meantime. And it's just very curious because I think the advice he was given was, I wouldn't want to say incorrect, but it kind of now he's looking to trade. It kind of brings up a range of issues for him, because potentially he's maybe obviously foregone a lot of potential VAT savings in terms of, so tax savings in terms of VAT, in terms of corporation tax, etc., etc.
So I presume he was incurring costs here. It wasn't just
Yes.
something he was sitting working on in his spare time. It wasn't a
Yeah,
hobby.
so it was very much a prototype, and he spent a lot of money using subcontractors for tooling, a bit of his own time. But again, as he wasn't trading, meant he couldn't have a salary, for example, which he'd kind of remunerate him for all this work. Yeah, he was obviously going through the process of getting some intellectual property as well. So all of these potential costs he's going to lose, and potentially lose out on a lot of tax savings. And the reason why I got involved was on the R&D angle, and then it suddenly throws up a whole myriad of issues there in terms of at what point do you consider the tax point of these for VAT, for corporation tax, for R&D.
Yeah,
and to be honest, I haven't fully got to the bottom of it myself, to be honest.
Is there a point here then, Jack, that if he's trying to answer an unknown, is my shorthand way of R&D, if you're trying to do something not been done before, loosely, or improve a process, or all those things, at what point did it happen? And was he actually in business when it happened? If he's been at it for a while, is there a danger that he actually solved the unknown thing a year ago, just hasn't got around to actually commercialising it? And
yeah, and
by the time his
potentially
business starts, it was actually a known rather than an unknown. Is there a possibility of that? Or
yeah, I mean, because another kind of misconception around R&D is that people consider the entire project from start to finish as like qualifying for R&D. It's actually very specific parts of the project where the R&D is being undertaken, which actually qualifies, where the point where you have an uncertainty, where you feel like you have to push the technological baseline of your entire field further forward. So that means that any time that you spend trying to level the playing field, so in saying like your knowledge is here, but the industry standards here, like any work to push your knowledge up doesn't qualify as R&D. But also the fact that if in that scenario where if you are pushing above what the technological baseline is, that it's only the time that you're spending that's the only point where you've established the uncertainty and are working to overcome it. I think a lot of people think like, well, the work started on this date and then it got rolled out on this date. So any time we spent on it doing anything on this project qualifies for R&D. It's actually, well, there's a bit at the start of the project where you're kind of establishing things, and getting all the ducks in a row, planning, etc., which falls under
and catching up. You're catching up on knowledge rather than making new knowledge.
Understanding where where your competitors are at, what their technological baseline is. Only at that point where you establish that and realize you need to go beyond it is where you do the R&D. And at the point where the uncertainty comes, where you either worked out you can push that technological baseline and overcome that uncertainty, or if you can't, that's the point where the R&D ends. And then that generally leads on to the kind of rollout stage, the production stage, the marketing stage, the kind of launch period. That all of that stuff doesn't qualify. So it's an interesting point that potentially the tax point will be, depending on kind of the advice we give him, is that the tax point could potentially be the first day that he starts officially trading. He may be allowed some of those expenditure for general corporation tax, and some of that may be qualified, would recover some of the VAT on it. But for R&D, potentially not, because again, if HMRC, with the current mood they're in terms of inquiring, they can look back and go, well, as far as I'm concerned, that invoice date says 2020, that invoice says 2015. That stuff's not allowable. So it's a very interesting one. So I suppose the other point is that you're in a unique scenario where you're developing a new product or a prototype, is to make sure that you've had that advice around what your trading structure should be, because potentially could be losing out on, in terms of a 70,000, 80,000 pounds worth of it outlay over the past 7 years, potentially might only get a fraction of that back in terms of.
How does that happen, Jack? Because you would think, and I know you're going to be diplomatic in your answer, so you probably can't say what you're probably thinking. But if someone said to you, "I'm, devising a new thing. I'm trying to learn how to do something that's never, I'm coming up with a new product, a new project." The default answer for at least 7 years has been, "Well, there might be some R&D there. We need to look at that."
Mhm.
Is it that you think the taxpayer or the client or the prospect hasn't described what they were doing to their advisor? Or do you think the advisor just didn't ask the questions as to what they would do? Like, what?
Knowing their scenario is quite interesting, because he was kind of part of a smaller practice, which then got rolled up into a bigger practice. And the reason why he ended up with us is because he was basically told by his new accountant that he wasn't kind of within their usual size. So basically said, go away and get some other advice.
Right.
But yeah, there was certainly an element of neglect there, I would say, where he was given some initial bad advice, almost to kind of fob him off, I suppose, just to be like, yeah, go away and just leave us alone.
Well,
And then
we're not bothered. Yeah.
And then he's come back to them and went like, okay, so I've gone away and I've done this. Like, what about now? And they just kind of went, well, what, you're going to start trading? Oh, too small, go away. So
Interesting.
it's a difficult.
I mean, it's interesting because we're not criticising people for having
No.
a chosen audience there, but also if you're not going to give advice, be clear that you're not advising. Don't just say we're not bothered. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So it was a very interesting one, and I still haven't quite got to the bottom of it. So I'll be mulling over that over the next couple of days in terms of what we can do.
Well, good luck. Good luck. Yeah. See what you can salvage, I suppose, because that's where you are now. You're at the salvage. And all too often with the clients that we see, they're already at the point where salvage is often all you can do, isn't it?
And it's a shame because it's not like the example you were talking about the tribunal that is books and records are all over the place. He's got everything neatly compiled, ready to go at the point where he's going to start trading, but it's almost a little bit of a moot point if it turns out it's going to be like, well, okay, we'll bring all of this stuff in, but I'm not sure how much of this you can get back in terms of taxable relief. So
yeah. Ironically, HMRC have been pretty okay with letting people put R&D claims in, but they're now much tougher. So you've actually got a double whammy that he's hitting a window when the HMRC are having a bit of a crackdown as well, isn't it?
Totally, yeah. So it's completely it's a lot harder now. If there's absolutely no room for maneuver whatsoever, because the probability of something coming up is of being inquired is increased significantly. And they've taken a lot more of a hard arbitrary line on the inquiries as well, to the point where it's just guilty until proven innocent. So everything is considered not R&D until you can demonstrate that it is, despite you've already sent in some initial evidence to suggest that. So
despite already proven it was R&D.
Yes, they ask the same questions back to you that you've already answered to them originally.
Well, like I say, good luck. Good luck with that salvage job.
It'll be fine.
My next one's an interesting one that I seem to remember seeing something about this maybe 10 years ago now. I can't remember. If anyone remembers seeing me talk to landlords yonks ago, let me know. But there is a movement for something called a tax check to be carried out for certain business activities when they apply for licenses. Now, this has been extended. So in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, basically, taxi drivers are where the next rollout here is. But if you're a taxi driver, when you apply for your license, you have to provide a basic summary to demonstrate that you are in fact registered with HMRC. It's not a tax audit. They're not going to inquire. They're not going to check. It's a fairly cursory glance. But you have to prove that you are at least registered.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I remember seeing a consultation on this many years ago now. And it was quite interesting because it was about the time when in Newcastle, certainly, but not nationally, they were bringing in licenses for HMO properties, so house of multiple occupation, your typical student let. If you do room share student lets and there's more than three in a household, you've got to have a license. Newcastle Council have also extended licensing on a lot of properties, not just HMOs. And I think it would be reasonable to say there's a movement generally to have all landlords registered, to have a license, for want of a better word. So I think it's quite interesting to see where this is going to go, because the list of businesses that need to have a license to operate is actually fairly high. You know, if you doormen, I'm pretty sure are licensed, taxi drivers are certainly licensed, dog breeders are licensed, certainly accountants and tax advisors are, but also landlords have to have a license to let property in certain areas of the country now. It wouldn't be hard for HMRC to say, well, we've proven that this concept is flushing out people who aren't declaring because their licenses are being refused because they couldn't prove they were registered with HMRC. It'd be interesting to see where this ends up, because any tool that HMRC have that flushes people out and onto their radar can only be a good thing, surely. I would agree that anything they've got that makes people pay their fair share is a great thing. I wonder, therefore, where this could go next. And it doesn't feel like it would be long before, if you want to register a property, you have to be, because this is already in consultation as well. I think the Renters Reform Bill that's going to come before Parliament, as in there will be a list of registered landlords. So how easy would it then be for HMRC to say, you'll only get a license if you're registered with us, as well as being a registered landlord? That seems to me to be a nice, simple next logical step, that if I was in the Treasury, I'd be saying, let's just do that. So yeah, I just wonder which other businesses are going to try and get the licenses and then fail because they haven't made declarations.
So, I mean, a couple of questions off the back of that then is kind of how cursory are these checks? Is it just kind of providing a UTR number?
I think it's just that you are registered. So what it says here is what's involved. According to HMRC, the tax check should take a few minutes each time an operating license is applied for or renewed. The check is superficial and merely confirms that you're correctly registered with HMRC. So I think, for instance, if this was a landlord, it would just be that you've got a UTR and maybe provide a copy of your tax year overview or your FA 302 to show there is in fact rental income on there. It won't be, so for a landlord, they couldn't easily check because the information is just not on the return that number 17, Baker Gardens is being declared. But they will at least check you are a landlord that is making a declaration. So basically, probably quite similar to the way that mortgage lenders do. If you're getting a buy-to-let mortgage, they want to see that there is rental income on your return and that you're up to date. They don't look at the numbers. They just make sure that there's correlation between what you're telling them for rental purposes and what you've submitted to HMRC. So landlords are used to this. But of course, if you're not getting mortgages or you're not remortgaging, you're not having to do that, it'd be very easy just to not declare your rent. A call I had this morning is from a lady who's been renting a property for about 12 or 13 years and has never paid a penny of tax. And the revenue have basically sent her a letter to say you've got 30 days to start a discussion about coming clean. That could easily have been flushed out if it's a property in Newcastle that is now licensed. Because, of course, all of the information is in the, without sounding like a conspiracy nut, it's all in the government domain, isn't it? Licensing, local government, it's all government, it's all data that in theory is within HMRC's grasp. So it'll be interesting to know where they got her from and whether it was something like this.
Yeah, I suppose the second question then is, do you think it will kind of discourage people with a second property, again, maybe inheriting a parent's property, for example, kind of dabbling in the rental market? Like, oh, can't be asked to go through the licensing process. Maybe I don't want that.
I don't think so. I think with all of these things, I think what it'll actually do is if someone says you need a license to rent the property out, if they've just put someone in and not licensed, they're also not going to be submitting anything to HMRC. So the two-factor authentication, for want of a better way of putting it, will fail because neither one of the two will have been triggered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you're submitting a tax return to HMRC for a property in Newcastle, the licensing team in theory should be able to go, why have you not got a license?
Mm-hmm.
And equally, if you've applied for a license but you're not submitting, there would be a disconnect. But if you don't do either, I think it'd be quite easy to continue
There's
not doing either. Which
potential
is
black
always the
market
problem.
then, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's always the problem that there's a two-tier market here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like if you're making your own bootleg, whiskey. You don't get the food safety standards in to
Yeah.
put a star rating on your kitchen, do you?
Yeah, we've got a
So,
high food hygiene rating and all of that stuff.
yeah, but you're also not then paying, the alcohol duty, and you're not paying tax on your profits. You're not doing any of it.
Yeah.
So, I think an interesting one would be these people then still tend to insure their properties though. So if you take this to, where might you be in 10 years? You're in direct line. Can you insure my buy to let? Yes, absolutely. Show me that you're a licensed landlord. Otherwise, you're not going to insure the property. And as soon as you then start putting proper financial jeopardy on the table, I think that's the way you flush it out. But certainly an interesting move. And I think again, if we've got the compliant, the people who are doing what they need to, and the non-compliant, there's the bit in the middle where people are doing some of the things they're meant to. This will flush them out to some degree. The hardcore non-compliers, there needs to be something. It needs to be different.
Yeah.
Because they're just not going to do it either way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I suppose what else was I going to say on it was I've completely forgotten. Never mind.
Good point. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, good point.
A point well made.
I just felt it slipping away from my mind, like trying to hold water in your hands.
If it's okay, I'm gonna mull that one over, and we'll let viewers know what I think on that final point next week, if that's all right.
I obviously didn't warn you about what I was going to ask, so I may have blindsided you there with
you've
hard hitting.
You've asked me a tough one. But listen, that's been about half an hour, so I suppose what we're summarising is, if you're starting a new business, make sure you've spoken to someone for proper advice about how to record your expenditure, otherwise it may be lost. Keep basic records if you're trying to make an expense claim. This was an NHS doctor, quite interestingly, just unreliable witness. If you need a license for something, it probably means HMRC are watching, I would say.
No, definitely.
Until next week. Thank you very much, everyone. As always, we look forward to hearing what you thought. Let us know your comments.
Absolutely.